Stepping into the family reunion, the first thing to catch my eye was not a welcoming smile but a glossy yearbook. Beneath each relative sat a prestigious career title. Below mine rested one cold word: unemployed. My entire family had agreed upon this fabricated failure, printing it for every guest. What they did not know was that in exactly 2 hours, my face would cover Time magazine, detonating a truth that would shatter their boastful wealthy charade forever. I am Isla Thomas. The ocean breeze carrying the scent of salt and crushed pine needles offered a brief illusion of peace before the chaos began. The coastal resort, a sprawling estate of white marble and manicured lawns on the eastern seaboard, was rented entirely for our annual family reunion. I arrived exactly 3 hours before the first scheduled cocktail reception. It was a calculated decision. Arriving early meant I could bury myself in the administrative debris of the event. I preferred the quiet safety of setting up welcome bags and arranging the seating charts over the exhausting performative rituals of greeting my extended relatives. The Thomas family did not simply gather. We held summits. Every reunion was a carefully orchestrated exhibition of wealth, status, and competitive success. By managing the check-in table, I became part of the furniture, invisible and unbothered, stepping out of the glaring spotlight my family so desperately craved. I stood behind the long mahogany table draped in crisp white linen. Stacked neatly in the center were 50 thick, glossy volumes, the family yearbook. This was a new addition to the weekend schedule, a project spearheaded by my older sister, Sloane Thomas Bennett. I reached out and picked up the top copy. The cover was heavy leather, the title embossed in thick gold foil. I opened it. The scent of fresh, expensive ink wafted up, reminding me of corporate brochures and high-stakes legal contracts. It was essentially an annual report for a corporation, but the assets were people. I turned the crisp pages. There was my cousin, grinning in a tailored suit with his title as a regional director of surgical operations listed below his pristine family portrait. There was my uncle, his biography boasting about the acquisition of 3 commercial properties in the last 12 months. It was a grotesque display of modern American aristocracy. The pages smelled of desperate validation. I saw second cousins who had inherited trust funds described as self-made entrepreneurs. I saw aunts who spent their days managing country club disputes branded as philanthropic visionaries. The yearbook was a meticulously curated fiction, designed to hide the ugly truths of bad marriages, borderline unethical business practices, and profound emotional emptiness. It was the Thomas family Bible, and its only commandment was to never, under any circumstances, look like a failure. Then, I turned to the section dedicated to the immediate family. I found my portrait. It was a photograph from 4 years ago. Back when my smile was sharper and my wardrobe consisted entirely of corporate armor, beneath my name, there was no list of recent acquisitions. There was no mention of the grueling, invisible work I'd been doing in the shadows. There was only one line, printed in a clean, mercilessly bold font. Currently unemployed. Taking time to rebuild. The words sat there, stark and unapologetic on the heavy white paper. There had been no phone call prior to this printing. No polite inquiry asking how I would like my current situation to be represented to the extended family. The judgment had been passed, agreed upon, and permanently bound in expensive leather. The humiliation was not loud or violent. It was a quiet, suffocating social execution. It was the realization that my blood relatives had sat around a dining table, analyzed my life, and distilled it down to a polite euphemism for a pathetic failure. A shadow fell across the crisp pages. I looked up to see Sloane standing on the opposite side of the table. She wore a silk dress the color of pale champagne, her hair styled into effortless, expensive waves that cost hundreds of dollars to achieve. She glanced at the open book in my hands and offered a thin, perfectly symmetrical smile that did not reach her eyes. "I wrote it that way to make it easy to understand," Sloane said, her tone light, brushing off the sheer cruelty of the printed words as if she were doing me a favor. "Because honestly, Isla, No one has the time to stand around and hear you explain those vague, messy things you have been doing. People want clear labels. It is better to just own the gap year. It shows humility. She adjusted a towering floral arrangement on the table, not even bothering to look me in the eye as she delivered the verdict. Before I could formulate a response that would not shatter the fragile, superficial peace of the afternoon, the sharp click of low heels against the marble floor signaled our mother approaching. Our mother was a woman whose entire nervous system was tethered to public perception. She moved with a frantic energy hidden beneath a pastel designer suit. Her eyes darted from the open book in my hands to my face, instantly sensing the rigid tension in my shoulders. "Isla, please," our mother whispered, her voice tight with suppressed panic and a familiar, exhausting pleading. "Do not make a scene out of this, not today. We have the in-laws arriving in less than 45 minutes. There are business partners, society friends, and people we have known for 30 years coming to this dinner. Keeping our dignity intact is far more important right now than debating the semantics of your career choices. Just let it go." Before the suffocating weight of her words could fully settle into my chest, my father materialized beside us. He was a man who viewed his family as an extension of his own professional brand. He placed a heavy, grounding hand on my shoulder, physically steering me a few steps away from the main thoroughfare, isolating me from Sloane and my mother. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Listen to me," he instructed gently, though there was a core of iron beneath the soft delivery. "If anyone starts asking questions tonight, just look them in the eye and say, 'You are doing freelance consulting.' It sounds significantly less bad than being unemployed. It implies you are still in the game, just between lucrative contracts. Do not give anyone a reason to look down on you or pity you. We are Thomases. We do not do pity. Freelance consulting, the universal corporate translation for being lost at sea." My father believed he was throwing me a life raft, but in reality, he was just handing me a better-looking anchor. He could not fathom that a person might intentionally step off the ladder. In his world, you were either climbing or you were dead. I nodded slowly, offering him the silent compliance he desperately needed to get through the evening. The relief that washed over his face was almost tragic. I looked at my father, then at my mother, who was nervously checking her diamond watch, and finally at Sloane, who was now greeting the resort manager with a radiant, practiced laugh. The sheer absurdity of their coordinated effort to manage my perceived failure washed over me in a cold wave. They had built an entire architecture of lies and euphemisms to protect themselves from the embarrassment of my existence. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream, cry, or demand an apology. I did not threaten to walk out of the resort. I simply walked back to the check-in table, gently closed the heavy yearbook, and set it down with a soft, definitive thud. My utter lack of a reaction, the absolute stillness in my posture, seemed to unnerve the air around me. From across the expansive lobby, seated quietly in a high-backed leather wing chair, Grandpa Warren was watching. The patriarch of the family, well into his late 80s, was a man of few words but sharp instincts. He said absolutely nothing, making no move to intervene. He just observed me with narrowed, assessing eyes. Amidst the frantic image management of my parents and the smug satisfaction of my sister, Grandpa Warren was the only one who recognized a dangerous calm that did not belong to a defeated woman. Exactly at that moment, a muted buzz vibrated against my hip. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with a secure, encrypted message from a blocked number. It contained only 2 short sentences. "Embargo still holds. Midnight confirmed." I read the words once. The cold, heavy stone of humiliation that my family had tried to place in my chest dissolved instantly into something sharp, electric, and utterly lethal. I locked the screen immediately, the display turning black, slipping the device back into my pocket as if it were nothing but a passing breeze. I smoothed the front of my shirt, perfectly composed, ready to play the invisible, unemployed role they had so carefully scripted for me. knowing full well that the stage they were standing on was rigged with dynamite. The first wave of guests breached the lobby doors exactly on the hour. They arrived not with the warm, chaotic embrace of long-lost relatives eager to reconnect, but with the calculated, predatory precision of delegates descending upon an elite industry convention. The valets outside were running frantically, parking an endless stream of sleek European sedans and oversized, pristine luxury vehicles. Inside, the grand foyer of the resort quickly transformed into a high-stakes networking mixer disguised as a bloodline celebration. As each family unit checked in at the front desk, they were immediately handed their pristine copy of Sloane's meticulously crafted yearbook. It was a masterclass in social conditioning. It was fascinating and entirely sickening to watch the immediate shift in their collective behavior. They held the heavy gold-embossed volumes exactly like programs at an exclusive corporate awards ceremony. Before initiating a conversation, before even making genuine eye contact across the crowded room, I watched aunts, uncles, and distant cousins discreetly flip to the index, locate a name, and scan the listed career achievements. They needed to ascertain the current market value of the person they were about to speak with before committing to a simple hello. My cousins descended upon the cocktail area displaying the ultimate American success package. They looked like stock photos generated for a wealth management brochure. They wore tailored linen suits, silk blouses, and expensive watches that cost more than a standard vehicle, their voices booming with the practiced, hollow confidence of people who have never been told no. There was Marcus, the sports medicine physician, standing near the bar and loudly detailing the complex knee reconstruction he had just performed on a starting professional athlete. Next to him stood Elena, the brand director for a massive global cosmetics conglomerate, casually dropping the names of international celebrities she had supposedly dined with last Tuesday evening. Then came Grant, the litigation attorney turned aggressively popular financial podcast host, holding a glass of 20-year-old scotch and lecturing a captive audience of younger relatives about maximizing real asset portfolios in volatile urban markets. They spoke in a rapid-fire, exhausting dialect of corporate buzzwords. They talked about leveraging synergies, optimizing personal bandwidth, executing hard pivots, and establishing total market dominance. To be in their presence was to be aggressively pitched to an endless commercial for their own magnificent existences. Sloane naturally absorbed the frantic energy of the room like a perfectly engineered solar panel. She had positioned herself strategically near the physical center of the grand hall, bathed in the soft, flattering light of a massive crystal chandelier. Whenever a new guest approached her orbit, she extended a perfectly manicured hand, allowing them to read the invisible, glowing marquee flashing directly above her head, Senior Regional Vice President at Belmere Development. The title was a heavy, impressive weapon, and she wielded it with ruthless, practiced grace. Belmere was not just any standard firm. They were currently the rising titans of urban development across the wealthy coastal states, rapidly acquiring massive tracts of land and launching highly publicized revitalization projects. People looked at Sloane with a potent mixture of deep, biting envy and reverent awe. She was the undisputed golden child of the evening, the walking, talking, undeniable proof that the Thomas family bloodline bred absolutely nothing but high-yield, aggressive winners. Our mother acted as Sloane's personal, unpaid public relations manager. She glided through the increasingly crowded room, her hand lightly resting on the small of Sloane's back, physically steering her successful daughter toward the most influential older relatives and the wealthiest family friends in attendance. Our mother's voice was a loud, melodic trill of absolute pride as she introduced the senior vice president over and over again. But that flawless performance violently fractured the exact moment her anxious gaze landed on me standing near the periphery. Whenever an inquisitive guest turned their attention my way, my mother's bright, camera-ready smile instantly tightened into a rigid, panicked line. She would physically step in front of me, throwing her body into the conversation like a protective shield made of pure social anxiety. She spoke in hushed, hurried tones, frantically wrapping my entire existence in sugary, pathetic euphemisms. She confidently told a retired federal judge that I was bravely exploring new horizons. She informed a prominent local socialite that I was taking a much-needed restorative sabbatical to focus entirely on personal wellness and spiritual alignment. She sold my perceived failure with the desperate, sweating energy of a corrupt real estate agent trying to offload a condemned house with a crumbling foundation before the roof caved in. Not everyone in the room accepted the politely sugar-coated narrative. Aunt Patricia, a wealthy widow whose entire personality was built on delivering passive-aggressive observations, marched straight through the crowd toward me. She clutched the heavy yearbook in her left hand, her diamond ring catching the light, her index finger ruthlessly marking the exact page of my printed humiliation. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her gin martini, her pale eyes sweeping critically over my simple, unbranded black dress. A thin, mocking smirk played on her perfectly painted lips. She told me I was terribly brave. She said leaving a career section entirely blank in this current, unforgiving economic climate was a remarkably bold choice, tilting her head to ask if I was just planning to float on the wind indefinitely while the rest of the world worked. Before I could offer a blank, silent stare in return, Uncle Richard materialized beside her. He smelled overwhelmingly of aged bourbon, expensive cigars, and outdated patriarchy. He patted my shoulder with a heavy, patronizing thud, treating me exactly like a wounded, slightly dim-witted animal that needed to be put out of its misery. He leaned in close, his breath hot and deeply unpleasant, advising me that women rapidly approaching their late 30s simply could not afford to be so fiercely independent and picky. He instructed me to find a simple desk job, secure a steady, reliable paycheck, and lock down a husband before my biological and professional options dried up completely. He ended his speech by kindly adding that I could go back to dreaming about changing the world after I had a properly funded retirement account. The sheer, concentrated weight of their condescension was meticulously designed to crush my spirit, but I let it pass right through me like a ghost. I did not engage. I did not defend myself. Instead, I allowed the natural current of the room to sweep me toward the back of the hall, pulled securely into the invisible orbit of the catering staff and the frantic event coordinators. The entire family silently agreed that this was my rightful, logical place. If I could not contribute to the gross domestic product of the mighty Thomas legacy, I could at least make myself physically useful. I seamlessly became the invisible hands of the evening. I greeted late arrivals at the door without bothering to introduce myself. I arranged the towering piles of expensive welcome gifts into perfectly symmetrical pyramids. I walked the exhausting length of the massive dining tables, meticulously adjusting the silver forks by fractions of an inch and realigning the embossed gold leaf name tags so they were perfectly parallel to the edge of the linen. I was the hired help in a formal dress, moving silently and completely unnoticed behind the velvet rope of my own family. I accepted the menial labor willingly and without a single complaint. The repetitive physical tasks kept my hands occupied and my mind violently, dangerously sharp. I was standing at the far edge of the secondary logistics table, quietly stacking surplus itineraries and gathering extra seating charts. The area was dimly lit and relatively quiet, tucked away behind a massive, fragrant floral display, completely shielded from the deafening roar of mutual admiration and clinking glasses echoing in the main hall. I reached out to gather a stray copy of the family yearbook that some careless cousin had abandoned face down on the wrinkled silk tablecloth. As I pulled the heavy book toward my chest to stack it with the others, my eyes locked onto the bottom right corner of the back cover. I stopped breathing for exactly one fraction of a second. The ambient noise of the party instantly vanished from my ears. There, printed discreetly but with absolute clarity beneath the glossy finish, was a corporate sponsor logo. It was a highly stylized crest, featuring an abstract ocean wave crashing over a solid foundation stone. I knew every pixel of that image. It was a logo I had spent the last 36 months obsessively tracking through thousands of pages of redacted legal documents, buried tax returns, and offshore banking records. The elegant text printed directly below the crest read, "Belmere Foundation, a proud sponsor of the Thomas family reunion." I stood perfectly still, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I traced the sharp edge of the printed logo with my thumb, staring at the physical proof that my family was not just celebrating blindly, they were actively drinking the champagne funded by the very monster I was about to slaughter. 36 months ago, I was not the invisible woman arranging name cards behind a mahogany table. I was the architect. I held the title of lead quantitative strategist at Crescent Harbor Recovery Group. We were a prestigious, aggressively expanding consulting firm specializing in post-disaster reconstruction and financial recovery packages for municipalities and county governments across the country. I was the absolute golden child of my bloodline long before Sloan ever claimed the throne. My life was a high-speed blur of first-class airport lounges, tailored wool suits, and high-level municipal budget meetings. I spoke the only language my family truly respected and understood. I talked endlessly about aggressive growth metrics, strategic municipal alliances, and securing multi-million-dollar government contracts. My parents used to parade my achievements at dinner parties like a prized racehorse. I was making a mid-six-figure salary by the time I was 29 years old. I was the ultimate, undeniable return on their parenting investment. My specific job was to build predictive spatial data models. After a catastrophic hurricane decimated the Gulf Coast, or a massive, uncontrolled wildfire leveled a Northern California county, my team would map out the economic recovery logistics. It was theoretically supposed to be about allocating federal relief funds efficiently, getting essential resources, and rebuilding grants to the hardest-hit residential zones. I believed I was doing noble work disguised as corporate strategy, but then, during the chaotic aftermath of a particularly brutal storm season, I found the shadow ledger. It was late on a Tuesday night in an empty office building. I was digging deep into the back-end architecture of the spatial mapping software I had personally designed. I noticed a complex overlay algorithm I had not authorized. Crescent Harbor was not just mapping disaster zones to distribute government aid. They were deliberately filtering the raw destruction data by median household income, historical mortgage insurance default rates, and generational vulnerability. They were precisely identifying the specific neighborhoods least likely to afford the exhausting, expensive rebuilding process. I stared at the glowing monitor as the horrific truth materialized in perfectly organized, color-coded columns. My company was packaging this highly sensitive vulnerability data and quietly selling it to predatory real estate conglomerates and private equity firms through shell subsidiaries. They were weaponizing my systems to target desperate families who had just lost absolutely everything. While the ashes of their living rooms were literally still smoking, these firms would swoop in, offering terrifyingly low cash payouts, pennies on the dollar, to buy the ruined land. The spreadsheets were completely pathologically devoid of human suffering. In those encrypted files, a displaced family of 4 sleeping on cots in a high school gymnasium because their roof had caved in was simply categorized as distressed inventory. Their absolute world-shattering desperation was neatly calculated as a prime investment opportunity with a guaranteed high-yield return. I did not go to the press immediately. I was arrogant and naive enough to believe it was a rogue department, an isolated ethical breach. I printed hundreds of pages of system logs, took the evidence directly to the managing partners on the top floor of our glass-walled headquarters, and demanded a full internal audit. I laid the papers on a massive oak conference table. The 3 men in the room did not look shocked. They did not look appalled. They looked profoundly annoyed that I was wasting their time. The senior partner leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and calmly told me I was overthinking a standard market efficiency protocol. When I refused to back down, when I explicitly called it disaster profiteering, the tone in the room violently shifted. The carrot came first. They offered me an immediate promotion to junior partner, a 30% bump in my base salary, and a massive, life-changing end-of-year bonus if I simply signed a new ironclad non-disclosure agreement and looked the other way. When I pushed the contract back across the table, the stick came out. They calmly and methodically explained that the consulting world was incredibly small and heavily connected. If I walked out that door making wild, unsubstantiated accusations against a billion-dollar firm, they would ensure I never worked in corporate strategy again. They promised to ruin my professional reputation so thoroughly, to bury me in so many retaliatory defamation lawsuits, that I would not be able to get a job analyzing data for a local grocery store. I stood up, left my corporate security badge on the oak table, and walked out of the building without saying another word. I did not just quit my job that morning. I systematically dismantled my entire existence. Within 4 weeks, I sold my luxury downtown apartment at a slight loss just to move the capital quickly. I liquidated my aggressive stock portfolios, withdrew almost every single dollar from my high-yield savings accounts, and packed what was left of my life into 3 standard cardboard boxes. I severed my ties with the corporate ecosystem completely. I knew I was about to start a massive, bloody war against an entrenched system, and you absolutely cannot fight a war while chained to a heavy mortgage and an expensive lifestyle. The hardest part was not walking away from the money or the power. The hardest part was trying to explain it to my blood. I drove to my parents' house on a quiet Sunday afternoon to tell them I had officially resigned. I sat in their perfectly decorated living room and tried to explain the data. I tried to make them see the exhausted faces of the people being aggressively priced out of their ruined neighborhoods. I talked about the clear ethical line I simply could not cross without losing my soul, but they just stared at me as if I were speaking a dead, alien language. They could not comprehend why anyone would voluntarily walk away from a corner office over something as abstract and unprofitable as morality. My mother looked at me with genuine, unadulterated horror, immediately asking how I was going to pay for my private health insurance and what she was supposed to tell her friends at the club. My father, his face flushing with deep pragmatic anger, demanded to know if I had secured another executive position before throwing such a foolish, idealistic tantrum. When I told them I was starting from scratch, operating in the shadows to fight the very system I helped build, their eyes completely glazed over. They only heard one thing. Their daughter had just thrown a prestigious, highly lucrative career into the garbage for a vague, childish ideal. From that Sunday afternoon onward, my family took the messy, uncomfortable truth of my moral stand and aggressively sanitized it. They rewrote my history to fit their rigid capitalist worldview. In their minds, I had not made a principled, calculated exit. I had suffered a tragic mental collapse. I was a victim of severe corporate burnout. I had simply cracked under the immense pressure of high-level expectations. I became the tragic cautionary tale of the family, the brilliant girl who flew too close to the sun, failed spectacularly, and was now too terrified to rejoin the real world. It was infinitely easier for them to believe I was weak and directionless than to accept that the very economic system they worshipped and profited from was fundamentally rotting from the inside out. They built a comfortable, padded narrative around my perceived failure, treating my silence as absolute defeat. They were completely unaware that while they were pitying me, handing me name tags at a resort, and printing my failure in a glossy book, I had spent the last 36 months quietly and meticulously building the guillotine. The void I stepped into after leaving the corporate world was not empty. It was waiting to be built upon. I did not spend my days recovering or searching for a new corporate master to serve. Instead, I founded a small, fiercely guarded organization named Atlas Ledger. I established our base of operations in a cramped, windowless leased office located above a noisy dry cleaner on the edge of the city. In the beginning, there were only 4 of us. I recruited a brilliant, deeply cynical data engineer who had been quietly blacklisted from the major tech sectors for exposing a massive privacy breach. I found a ferocious housing aid attorney who had spent her entire professional life fighting illegal eviction notices in heavily marginalized, underfunded districts. I brought on a resilient field coordinator who used to manage logistics for international medical missions before burning out on endless bureaucratic red tape. And then there was me, the architect who knew exactly how the enemy designed their financial fortresses. Our objective at Atlas Ledger was never to build a flashy brand or launch a glossy public relations campaign. We had absolutely no interest in corporate visibility or securing vanity profiles in business journals. Our sole unwavering purpose was to trace the blood money. We hunted down every single diverted disaster relief dollar, every highly suspicious local land buyout contract, and every twisted insurance claim that miraculously favored the massive developers over the displaced, grieving residents. We built an entirely new, heavily encrypted investigative system. We operated with the precision and paranoia of a military intelligence unit. We cross-referenced obscure public property records with hidden local vendor contracts. We matched federal emergency management data with the agonizing, handwritten testimonies of displaced citizens. We spent 18 months tracking a single, seemingly innocuous shell company registered to a strip mall in southern Florida. That tiny, invisible entity was quietly purchasing hundreds of flooded coastal properties using state-subsidized recovery grants, only to immediately transfer the land deeds to a massive private equity firm based in Manhattan. We manually connected the signatures, the banking routing numbers, and the filing dates until the web was undeniable. Slowly and methodically, we exposed a staggering, highly coordinated model of post-disaster profiteering spanning the entire United States. To hunt apex predators, you must become a ghost. I deliberately stripped my life down to the absolute bare minimum. I rented a painfully ordinary second-floor walk-up apartment in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. I drove a reliable, deeply uninteresting 10-year-old sedan that blended seamlessly into any grocery store parking lot. My wardrobe consisted entirely of plain, unbranded clothing, devoid of any recognizable designer labels or status symbols. I completely abandoned all social media platforms, deleting my digital footprint with surgical precision. I stopped attending the lavish, self-congratulatory business conferences and charity galas my family so deeply cherished. Because our daily operations involved aggressive whistleblowing, complex federal litigation, and protecting vulnerable witnesses from severe corporate retaliation. My actual name rarely appeared on any public documents. I existed in official court filings and massive investigative dossiers merely as a set of redacted initials or hidden entirely behind the sterile, generic title of lead strategic director. My family looked at the austere, quiet surface of my existence and saw only a terrifying void. They measured a successful life through a very specific, rigid set of metrics. Because I had not secured a wealthy husband to elevate my social standing, because I was no longer boasting about securing massive corporate contracts over holiday dinners, and because I was no longer posting carefully curated photographs from business-class airport lounges, they reached the only conclusion their narrow worldview allowed. They decided I was stagnating. They looked at my disciplined anonymity and diagnosed it as a shameful, irreversible failure to launch. Their pity was infinitely more exhausting than their scorn. My mother had recently taken to mailing me physical clippings from women in business magazines, highlighting articles about late-stage career pivots, always accompanied by a sticky note urging me to simply try again. My father had stopped asking about my daily activities entirely. He preferred to discuss the weather or his lawn care regime, treating my professional life as if it were a terminal illness that we must politely ignore to keep the peace. They needed me to be broken so they could remain whole. They required my perceived failure to act as the dark, contrasting background against which their brilliant, heavily mortgaged successes could shine even brighter. While the opulent resort banquet hall buzzed with the deafening noise of clinking crystal glasses and aggressive networking, I stood completely still near the back wall, anchoring myself to the present reality. The air smelled of roasted meats, expensive perfumes, and sheer arrogance. My phone, silenced and resting deep in the pocket of my simple dress, began a steady, rhythmic vibration against my hip. I slipped my hand down, pressing my thumb against the biometric sensor to unlock the screen without pulling the device fully into view. It was a rapid succession of short, highly encrypted emails from my team, who were currently scattered across 3 different time zones. The first message was from the data engineer. It simply stated that the final server migration was completely finished and the raw data packets were securely locked for press distribution. The second email arrived less than a minute later from our lead attorney. She confirmed that the final preemptive legal injunctions had been successfully filed in federal court, ensuring the opposing corporate counsel would not have the necessary time to file a gag order and block the release. The third message was from the senior editor of the publication. It was a stark, one-line confirmation stating that the digital launch sequence was fully initiated and the physical copies of the magazine were already loaded onto the outbound distribution trucks. Everything was converging rapidly toward a singular, irreversible point in time. I shifted my weight, feeling the cool fabric of my pocket lining against my knuckles as another vibration pulsed against my leg. This message was from our field coordinator, reporting that the primary whistleblowers were securely relocated to safe houses and their emergency communication lines were active and monitored. The final pieces of the board were locking into place. I looked up and caught my own reflection in the towering mirrored panels lining the ballroom walls. I looked exactly the way my family wanted me to look. Quiet, diminished, unremarkable, but beneath that carefully constructed facade of the tragic, unemployed daughter, a massive, invisible empire was holding its breath. The sheer irony of the situation was intoxicating. My family had rented out an entire coastal resort, hired an army of caterers, and printed glossy leather-bound books just to celebrate their mastery of the universe. Yet, they were completely oblivious to the fact that the actual master of the universe was currently standing next to the spare linen cart, holding the absolute destruction of their entire corrupt ecosystem in the palm of her hand. I understood with sudden, chilling clarity that tonight was not merely a tedious family dinner meant to stroke their collective egos. It was a violent collision course. This opulent, boastful gathering was accidentally beautifully happening exactly as a massive truth bomb was preparing to detonate on a national scale. The countdown had officially begun. The fuse was lit, and there was absolutely nothing anyone in this grand, echoing room could do to stop the incoming shockwave. The transition from the grand foyer to the expansive outdoor terrace was seamless, marked only by the shift from forced, echoing laughter to the low, predatory hum of corporate networking mingling with the sound of crashing ocean waves. The sky above the coastal resort was bruised with the dark purple and deep orange hues of a dying sun. Waitstaff in immaculate white uniforms circulated with military precision, balancing heavy silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate, overpriced appetizers. I stood near the far edge of the stone balcony, leaning slightly against the cold marble balustrade, holding a simple glass of sparkling water with a twist of lime. I had intentionally positioned myself downwind of the main gathering, a silent, unobserved ghost lingering on the absolute perimeter of their lavish celebration. At the center of the terrace, bathed in the warm, flattering glow of tall patio heaters, Sloane was holding court. She possessed a terrifying, innate ability to command the oxygen in any room she entered. She held her champagne flute delicately by the stem, her diamond rings catching the firelight as she animatedly pitched the gospel of Belmere development to a captive, deeply envious audience of our aunts, uncles, and older cousins. I listened closely as her voice carried effortlessly over the ambient noise. She was describing her primary operational directive, referring to it proudly as the noble task of revitalizing underused coastal assets. She spoke with the practiced, polished cadence of a seasoned politician on a campaign trail. She painted a vibrant, heroic picture of Belmere swooping into dying, storm-ravaged municipalities like a benevolent corporate savior, injecting vital capital and modern infrastructure into areas completely abandoned by slow-moving federal relief programs. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, my throat suddenly dry and tight. To the untrained ear of our wealthy relatives, her monologue sounded like aggressive, commendable philanthropy, but I knew the actual translation. Revitalizing underused coastal assets was not a phrase born organically in a creative marketing session. It was a highly sanitized, legally bulletproof euphemism engineered by ruthless corporate defense attorneys. I recognized those exact 5 words instantly. I had spent countless hours staring at them on a glowing monitor in my cramped office, reading them over and over in a highly classified, heavily redacted internal strategic playbook dated October of the previous year. Belmere was not saving those devastated communities. They were systematically choking them out, intentionally delaying local recovery efforts to drive down property values before executing hostile land grabs. Before the sickening reality of her words could fully settle in my mind, Cousin Grant pushed his way forcefully into the inner circle. Grant was currently riding the dizzying high of his latest financial podcast analytics, and his ego was practically vibrating out of his tailored linen suit. He swirled a heavy glass of amber liquid, loudly interrupting Sloane to boast about his own brilliant portfolio maneuvers over the last 18 months. He practically shouted over the elegant string quartet playing softly in the background, bragging to the older generation that he had completely liquidated his stable. Low-yield tech stocks to aggressively purchase post-storm land across the southeastern seaboard. Smart people always see opportunity where others only see ruin, Grant declared confidently, flashing a wide, predatory grin that made my stomach turn. He proudly explained his aggressive investment thesis to the nodding crowd. He detailed exactly how the sheer desperation of uninsured, newly homeless families drove the price per acre down to historic, mouth-watering lows. He argued passionately that waiting for the smoke to clear or the floodwaters to fully recede was a fool's game. You had to buy the dirt while the previous owners were still crying over their lost living rooms. It was raw, unfiltered vulture capitalism stripped of all human empathy, and he was actively demanding a round of applause for his sociopathic financial foresight. Uncle Arthur, a man who had built his own considerable fortune executing ruthless corporate liquidations during the late 80s, immediately raised his glass of dark scotch in a gesture of profound respect. He offered a booming, cheerful toast to Grant and Sloane, praising the younger generation for possessing the cold, iron stomach required to turn chaos into value. The surrounding relatives murmured in solemn agreement, eagerly clinking their expensive crystal glasses together. I gripped the edge of the marble balustrade so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. The cold night air suddenly felt thick and suffocating in my lungs. It was a horrifying, paralyzing revelation. The complete absence of empathy was not an isolated character flaw found only in Grant or Sloane. It was the foundational bedrock of the Thomas family bloodline. They had successfully and thoroughly normalized extreme callousness. They did not view massive human tragedy, the tragic loss of generational homes, or the destruction of entire neighborhoods as a crisis requiring compassion or aid. They viewed it purely as a temporary market inefficiency waiting to be ruthlessly exploited for maximum personal gain. Unable to let Sloane monopolize the spotlight for too long, my mother aggressively inserted herself into the conversation. She smoothed the front of her expensive designer dress and proudly announced to the entire group that the Belmere Foundation had generously provided a substantial, six-figure financial grant to underwrite our luxurious reunion banquet tonight. She framed the massive corporate donation as a direct testament to Sloane's immense value and undeniable influence within the executive board. Hearing this public declaration, my father immediately stepped forward, adjusting his silk tie with a smug, deeply self-satisfied expression. He could never resist claiming his own share of the credit for any family victory. He casually mentioned how he had leveraged his decades of local political goodwill to assist Sloane's firm. He boasted loudly that he had personally signed several formal letters of recommendation, using his pristine, established reputation to help the Belmere Foundation bypass tedious bureaucratic red tape and secure private, closed-door meetings with zoning boards and city councils along the eastern seaboard. He puffed out his chest, genuinely believing he was playing the role of the benevolent, powerful patriarch, opening vital doors for his highly successful daughter. I stopped breathing entirely. The ambient noise of the party, the crashing waves, the string quartet, everything vanished into a sharp, ringing silence in my ears. The disparate pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together in my mind, forming a terrifying, high-resolution picture of impending doom. The corporate sponsor logo printed on the back of the family yearbook. Sloane holding a senior executive title at the absolute core of the corruption. my mother acting as an enthusiastic social liaison, laundering their toxic reputation through elite local charity networks. My father eagerly providing political cover and local access with his own signature. They were not merely innocent, ignorant bystanders catching stray bullets. They were active, willing participants in the very machine Atlas Ledger was currently dismantling piece by piece. They had eagerly tied the Thomas family name, our generational reputation, and this very weekend celebration to a predatory, illegal scheme that was mere hours away from facing massive federal indictments and catastrophic public exposure. The conversation reached its sickening peak when Sloane leaned in closely to the group, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial, highly theatrical whisper. She revealed to the breathless crowd that Belmere Development was currently finalizing a monstrous, unprecedented land acquisition deal down on the Gulf Coast. She bragged that this single transaction would secure thousands of acres of highly distressed waterfront property. She confidently declared that once the final ink dried on those specific contracts, the board of directors had guaranteed her an immediate promotion to a national executive director position. She was already mentally spending her massive completion bonus, entirely oblivious to the terrifying fact that those specific, fraudulent Gulf Coast contracts were currently sitting in heavily encrypted files on the desks of the most ruthless investigative journalists and federal prosecutors in the country. I remained absolutely silent in the shadows of the balcony. I did not step forward to offer a forced, congratulatory smile. I did not interrupt their collective, arrogant delusion with a single word of warning. For the first time all evening, the fundamental dynamic of the universe shifted entirely. This was no longer a petty, exhausting domestic drama about my wealthy family looking down on my supposedly failed, unemployed existence. The stakes had officially escalated far beyond personal humiliation. I was watching my own flesh and blood eagerly dig their own social and financial graves with golden shovels. They firmly believed they were standing on the absolute summit of American success, looking down on me with intense pity. But I was the only person on that terrace who fully understood that they were actually standing completely blindfolded at ground zero, smiling happily right next to the very system I was about to violently, permanently obliterate. The resort staff smoothly herded the entire congregation from the breezy oceanfront terrace into the grand ballroom just as the sun dipped completely below the horizon. The transition was signaled by the soft chiming of crystal water glasses and the booming voice of the event coordinator echoing over the state-of-the-art sound system. Inside the cavernous room, the sheer, unadulterated scale of the Thomas family ego was currently being projected onto a massive canvas drop screen dominating the front wall. It was time for the family spotlight, a supposedly lighthearted, affectionate tradition that actually served as yet another thinly veiled arena for competitive boasting and social hierarchy reinforcement. I took my assigned seat near the back of the room, intentionally positioned far away from the central tables, heavily reserved for the highest earners and the loudest voices. The heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed to a soft glow. A rhythmic, aggressively upbeat pop song pumped through the hidden speakers. The digital presentation began. We were subjected to a rapid-fire succession of polished photographs and highly exaggerated accolades. I watched as my cousins beamed brightly next to their newly purchased sailboats, and my uncles shook hands firmly with prominent local politicians. Each slide featured a nostalgic, slightly embarrassing childhood photograph, paired instantly with a current, highly expensive professional headshot, followed directly by their official corporate title and a supposedly witty, affectionate description written by the committee. The room roared with supportive, thunderous applause after every single transition. Then, the upbeat music abruptly faded out, replaced by a deliberately awkward, comedic sound effect that resembled a record scratching to a violent halt. The massive screen flashed bright white before settling on a photograph of me. It was not a recent image. It was a candid, slightly out-of-focus shot, taken during my sophomore year of college, well over a decade ago. I was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt, my hair pulled up into a messy, frantic knot, looking utterly exhausted and slightly lost while balancing a massive stack of library books. Beneath that severely outdated image, there was no professional headshot to balance the narrative. There was no mention of the grueling corporate hours I used to work or the massive data systems I had built. There was only a block of bold, imposing black text. Still figuring life out? Currently unemployed. Loves disappearing for months at a time. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the projection hung heavily in the air, magnified to 10 feet tall for absolute, undeniable clarity. For one agonizing, suspended second, there was total silence in the grand ballroom. Then, the laughter began. It rippled through the space in highly distinct waves. From the front tables, where Sloane and her immediate inner circle sat, bathing in their own superiority, the laughter was loud, sharp, and entirely intentional. It was the distinct sound of victors openly mocking the vanquished. From the peripheral tables, the chuckles were softer, nervous, and profoundly awkward. Distant relatives shifted uncomfortably in their upholstered dining chairs, quickly averting their eyes, deeply troubled by the display, but entirely unwilling to disrupt the established family hierarchy to defend me. Not a single person in that room full of blood relatives stood up. Not one voice called out to the audio-visual team to demand the insulting slide be taken down. They collectively swallowed the humiliation and accepted it as a perfectly valid form of dinner theater. The chandeliers slowly flickered back on to full brightness, leaving a heavy, suffocating atmosphere in their wake. Aunt Helen, a woman whose primary hobby was aggressively judging the life choices of younger women under the guise of deep Christian concern, leaned heavily across the white linen tablecloth. She reached out and patted my hand with a cold, clammy palm. Her voice dripped with a thick, condescending sympathy that made my skin crawl. She told me she knew the current job market was simply dreadful and unforgiving for people without a clear, marketable direction. She offered to speak personally with the head pastor at her local parish first thing on Monday morning. She assured me they were desperately looking for a new office manager to handle the Sunday bulletins, organize the choir robes, and answer the front telephone. "It is a very simple job," she noted loudly, projecting her voice to ensure the surrounding tables could hear her benevolent charity. "But at least it offers strict daily discipline, a desk with actual colleagues to talk to, and basic dental insurance. You really cannot afford to be wandering aimlessly at your age anymore, Isla." Before I could politely decline her insulting, pathetic offer to manage church newsletters, Grant seized the golden opportunity to pile on. He leaned far back in his chair, swirling his expensive wine glass, a smug, incredibly knowing smile plastered entirely across his face. He projected his deep broadcasting voice so it carried effortlessly across the dining room, ensuring maximum audience retention. He declared loudly that in his extensive professional experience, people who were intensely secretive and vague about their daily activities usually fell into one of two distinct categories. Either they were entirely unemployed and far too embarrassed to admit they were quietly living off their dwindling savings, or they were doing something so utterly menial, embarrassing, and worthless that it simply did not warrant mentioning in polite society. He raised his glass toward me in a mocking, theatrical salute, silently challenging me to prove his arrogant assessment wrong. Sloane, practically vibrating with the intoxicating high of a compliant, captive audience, decided it was the perfect moment to deliver the final, lethal blow. She turned fully in her chair, locking her dark, perfectly lined eyes directly onto mine. Her voice was terrifyingly calm and razor-sharp, cutting through the remaining ambient chatter in the room like a surgical scalpel. She stated clearly that the most frightening thing about my current situation was not my complete lack of financial success or my embarrassingly empty resume. She said the truly terrifying part was my absolute, chilling lack of shame regarding my own mediocrity. She told the entire room that I sat there, contributing absolutely nothing of value to the Thomas family legacy, yet I refused to even look properly embarrassed by my monumental failures. She called my silence a profound, unforgivable insult to the relentless work ethic and the prestigious standards of our family name. Every single eye in the immediate vicinity instantly darted toward my father, the patriarchal figure who was theoretically supposed to maintain order and protect his children. I looked directly at him, seated just 2 chairs away from me. I did not ask for a rescue, and I did not expect a grand defense, but I watched closely to see if a single ounce of genuine paternal instinct would override his pathetic, desperate need for social harmony and country club approval. He met my intense gaze for exactly 1 second before his eyes darted rapidly away, staring intensely down at his pristine silver salad fork. He leaned slightly in my direction, his jaw clenched painfully tight, and hissed a familiar, paralyzing command completely under his breath. "Do not make a scene today. Just sit quietly." Those 7 hushed words were the most violent, destructive act of the entire evening. By demanding my absolute silence, by flatly refusing to challenge Sloan or shut down Grant, my father officially validated every single insult hurled in my direction. He legally endorsed my public execution because defending his supposedly failed daughter was simply too socially inconvenient for his brand. The humiliation was no longer just an unkind prank pulled by siblings. It was now the fully ratified law of the family. I remained perfectly still, my face a carefully constructed mask of absolute chilling indifference. I did not flinch, I did not cry, and I certainly did not open my mouth to apologize for existing. The formal dinner service officially commenced, the catering staff flooding the room with heavy silver platters, and the loud conversation gradually shifted back to commercial real estate acquisitions and aggressive stock portfolios. The family moved on effortlessly, completely satisfied that they had successfully put me in my rightful, pathetic place. As the heavy dessert plates were finally being cleared away, the guests began to stand up and mingle around the edges of the room. I slowly stood up from my chair and walked toward the quietest, darkest corner of the ballroom, seeking a brief moment of oxygen away from the suffocating perfume and arrogance. From the deep shadows near the heavy velvet drapes, a solitary figure slowly approached. It was Grandpa Warren. He walked with a polished wooden cane, his steps incredibly slow and deliberate, but his eyes were infinitely sharper than anyone else in the building. He stopped just inches away from me. He did not offer pathetic pity. He did not offer a demeaning job at a local church. He simply looked at my impossibly calm posture, immediately sensing the massive, invisible kinetic energy vibrating violently just beneath my skin. He leaned in close, his voice a raspy, barely audible whisper that completely bypassed the terrible noise of the party. "What are you waiting for, Isla?" he asked. I looked down at the old man, the only person in our entire bloodline who understood that a true predator does not scream loudly before it strikes. I offered him the very first genuine smile I had worn all evening. It was small, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Not waiting." I replied softly, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "It is just not time yet." The nauseating wave of collective laughter from the slide presentation eventually dissolved into the sharp clatter of silver spoons against porcelain dessert plates. I did not retreat to my hotel room. I did not run away to hide my supposed shame. Instead, I began a methodical, terrifyingly quiet circulation of the grand ballroom. I was no longer playing the role of the humiliated, invisible sister. I was operating strictly as a lead investigator assessing the structural integrity of a massive building mere hours before its scheduled demolition. I needed to know exactly how deep the toxic rot went into my own bloodline. I needed to accurately map the exact blast radius of the incoming federal indictments. I found my father standing near a towering, intricately carved ice sculpture, swirling a heavy glass of expensive cognac and holding court with 2 prominent local judges. I approached smoothly, wearing a carefully constructed mask of polite, subdued curiosity. I waited for a natural lull in their boisterous conversation before casually asking him about his recent philanthropic networking, specifically mentioning the corporate sponsors he had been loudly championing all evening. He eagerly took the bait. He puffed out his chest, completely oblivious to the invisible legal trap closing tightly around his ankles. He proudly elaborated that his involvement with the Belmere Foundation went far beyond simply signing a few generic letters of introduction to the city council. He bragged loudly, his voice carrying over the string quartet, that he had served as the official honorary chairman for their massive, highly publicized fundraising gala down in Charleston right after the devastating hurricane season last fall. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. Honorary chairman. In the unforgiving eyes of a federal prosecutor or a ruthless investigative journalist, that specific title was not just a meaningless social accolade to be printed on a fancy invitation. It was a highly visible, documented endorsement. My father had willingly lent the pristine, heavily guarded Thomas family credibility to a massive, coordinated fraud operation. He had stood on a brightly lit stage, bathed in the applause of his wealthy peers, and actively encouraged deep-pocketed donors to pour capital into a foundation that Atlas Ledger had explicitly, undeniably linked to dark money laundering and aggressive land theft. He was legally and socially exposed on a catastrophic level. I left him to his arrogant boasting and navigated through the dense sea of silk dresses and tailored linen suits to find my mother. She was hovering anxiously by the elaborate dessert buffet, organizing a plate of miniature pastries with frantic, nervous energy. I stood beside her, picking up a silver dessert fork, and asked a seemingly innocent question about her current term on the regional social committee. She immediately lit up, desperate to prove her own high society value in a room full of overachievers. She enthusiastically detailed how she had personally deliberately invited several key Bellmere regional representatives to join her elite, closed-door charity networks over the past 12 months. She explained with immense pride that integrating these corporate executives into the local philanthropic scene helped establish them as deeply conscientious developers in the eyes of the skeptical community leaders. She had unknowingly acted as their premier, unpaid public relations shield. She was actively laundering their toxic, predatory corporate image through her prestigious social clubs, essentially handing apex predators the exact gilded keys they needed to enter the vulnerable henhouse. Across the expansive room, Sloane was still holding court, her voice echoing with supreme, unchallenged confidence as she dominated a conversation about coastal rezoning laws. I watched her carefully from a distance, analyzing her exact phrasing and her body language. I knew for an absolute fact that the highly touted rebuilding models she was actively promoting to our relatives were deeply, fundamentally corrupt. They were intrinsically tied to pushing out desperate, traumatized residents using highly coercive, aggressive legal contracts and forced buyouts, while the victims were literally still sleeping in temporary emergency shelters. But looking at Sloane, basking in the intoxicating adoration of our wealthy relatives, I realized the most terrifying truth of the entire night. She most likely did not know the actual, brutal mechanics of the devastation she was causing, or even worse, she had willfully, aggressively chosen to ignore the dark reality of her daily operations. She was a highly paid, beautifully dressed pawn, completely blinded by her own skyrocketing salary, her massive performance bonuses, and the intoxicating promise of national executive titles. The harsh legal reality of the impending situation crashed over me with the crushing weight of a concrete block. When the explosive story finally broke, when the national magazine officially hit the newsstands and the federal subpoenas began flying out of Washington, my family would probably not be indicted as the primary architects of the criminal enterprise. But they were standing entirely too close to the blast center to escape the shockwave. They would be violently sucked into the ensuing vortex of public shock and overwhelming social shame. They would face brutal, hours-long legal depositions, invasive witness investigations, and the total, highly public destruction of the pristine social reputation they worshipped above absolutely everything else. A fierce, brief surge of basic familial instinct urged me to grab my parents by the arms, pull them forcefully into a quiet, secure hallway, and beg them to call their corporate defense lawyers immediately. I desperately wanted to tell them to withdraw their names, resign from the charity boards, and legally scrub their signatures from every single Bellmere document before the clock struck midnight. But the cold, pragmatic, uncompromising voice of the Atlas Ledger lead attorney echoed loudly in my mind. Her legal instructions had been absolute, terrifyingly clear, and strictly binding. I was legally forbidden from providing any advance notice, directly or indirectly, to anyone with a vested interest in the targeted corporations. Tipping off my family could instantly trigger a massive, panicked destruction of digital evidence. It could prematurely alert the opposing corporate counsel, allowing them to file emergency injunctions, and it could completely derail 36 months of agonizing, highly dangerous investigative work. I was bound by a moral imperative and a non-disclosure agreement far more critical than simple family loyalty. I had to walk a razor-thin, incredibly dangerous line. I approached my parents as they reconvened near the main exit doors of the ballroom, preparing to formally bid the early departing guests farewell. I kept my voice incredibly low and deliberately steady, completely devoid of any visible emotion or panic. I looked directly into my father's eyes and casually suggested that given the current, highly volatile political climate surrounding aggressive coastal development, it might be a very prudent legal move to quietly review and formally retract any letters of recommendation he had recently signed for corporate entities he did not personally control. I then turned to my mother, gently advising her to immediately step back from blindly vouching for the philanthropic intentions of massive organizations when she did not have full, unrestricted access to their internal financial structures. I handed them the absolute keys to their own salvation, wrapping the vital information in a quiet, pragmatic warning. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for a tiny flicker of comprehension, a momentary pause of genuine reflection or caution. Instead, I watched their faces harden simultaneously into matching, impenetrable masks of absolute defensive condescension. My father let out a short, highly dismissive scoff, shaking his head slowly as if I had just suggested something utterly preposterous and childish. My mother sighed heavily, an exaggerated, theatrical sound of profound maternal exhaustion. They looked at each other, silently communicating their shared, pathetic diagnosis of my mental state. They honestly, truly believed I was standing there, entirely devoid of a respectable career and a fancy title, desperately trying to tear down their magnificent social achievements out of pure, bitter jealousy. They thought I was preaching hollow, pathetic morality simply because I lacked the basic intelligence and the relentless ambition to succeed in the real, cutthroat world. You really should not let your own professional stagnation make you so deeply cynical about other people achieving great things. Isla, my mother whispered sharply, her carefully chosen words designed to put me firmly back in my designated, miserable place. My father did not even bother to offer a verbal response. He simply turned his back on me to warmly greet a departing local politician, entirely dismissing my critical warning as the meaningless, irritating noise of a failed daughter. The sheer, overwhelming bitterness of the moment elevated the entire tragedy to a completely new, suffocating level. I had handed them a fully inflated life vest while they were standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, and they had arrogantly, violently thrown it back in my face, aggressively complaining about the cheap fabric. I stepped away from them without another word, retreating back into the dark shadows of the ballroom, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that I had done all I legally and morally could. The massive avalanche was already moving down the mountain, and they had just proudly chosen to stand exactly in its path. The stifling atmosphere of the grand ballroom was momentarily broken by the discreet, urgent approach of a man wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal gray suit. It was the general manager of the luxury resort. He moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of someone whose entire career depended on managing the highly volatile crises of wealthy patrons. He did not carry a silver tray or a glass of wine. He navigated smoothly through the crowded room, his eyes locked firmly on my position near the heavy velvet drapery. When he finally reached my side, he leaned in incredibly close, ensuring his voice remained a completely inaudible murmur to the surrounding guests. He respectfully requested a brief moment of my time, his tone tight with a carefully concealed layer of professional panic. He informed me that over the past 45 minutes, the resort's main reception desk had been aggressively inundated with a sudden, overwhelming barrage of incoming phone calls. These were not polite inquiries from lost relatives. The callers were highly demanding representatives from several major national media syndicates, leading investigative news desks, and prominent financial broadcast networks. They were rapidly bypassing the standard guest services extensions, aggressively demanding immediate, absolute confirmation of my physical presence on the property. The fortress walls of my family's private, secluded celebration were actively being breached by the chaotic, relentless outside world. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, betraying absolutely no surprise. I instructed the manager, using a voice of quiet, uncompromising authority, to immediately implement a total communications blackout regarding my name. I ordered him to instruct his entire front desk staff to firmly state that no guest matching my description was currently registered at the resort, and to abruptly terminate any further inquiries without offering any additional explanations. The manager offered a sharp, curt nod of total understanding, visibly relieved to have a clear directive, and quickly retreated toward the main lobby to secure the perimeter. Knowing the dam was already cracking, I turned and slipped silently through a set of heavy glass-paned French doors, stepping out onto a deeply shadowed, secluded stone balcony. The sudden blast of cold, salty ocean air hit my face, providing a violent, necessary contrast to the suffocating, perfumed heat of my family's arrogant exhibition inside. I reached into the deep pocket of my dress, retrieved a single, encrypted wireless earbud, and pressed it firmly into my right ear. I raised my phone, angling the screen away from the glass doors behind me, and initiated a highly secure, multi-point video conference. The screen illuminated my face with a pale, cold digital glow. 3 separate video feeds materialized instantly. I was staring at the tired, fiercely dedicated faces of my core Atlas Ledger executive team and our primary external media counsel. The lead attorney spoke first, his voice lacking any of the usual corporate pleasantries. He radiated the specific, terrifying adrenaline that only exists in the final moments before launching a massive, unprecedented legal offensive against a billionaire conglomerate. He officially confirmed that the final press embargo was holding firm across all participating networks. He rapidly outlined the synchronized launch sequence, the comprehensive, deeply researched investigative dossier, the hundreds of pages of sworn victim affidavits, the heavily redacted offshore financial ledgers, and the digital edition of the Global magazine were fully loaded onto the primary distribution servers. The execution command was permanently locked in. Everything was scheduled to detonate simultaneously exactly at midnight, Eastern Standard Time. The senior editor of the publication leaned closer to his respective camera, holding up a high-resolution physical proof of the upcoming magazine cover. My own face stared back at me from the small screen, looking incredibly stern and entirely unyielding. But the true danger was not my portrait. It was the explosive, 30-page investigative payload buried beneath the glossy cover. The lead article did not merely expose a few isolated incidents of corporate greed. It meticulously dismantled a massive, highly coordinated national syndicate of post-disaster profiteering. It traced billions of dollars in stolen relief funds and forced land acquisitions. And sitting squarely at the absolute, undeniable center of this massive, horrifying federal crime ring was Belmere Development. The exact same corporation currently funding the lavish shrimp cocktails and vintage champagne being consumed by my oblivious relatives just on the other side of the glass. The attorney interjected, his expression hardening into an uncompromising mask of absolute legal authority. He delivered a final, severe directive, his eyes practically piercing through the digital connection. He explicitly reminded me that hundreds of millions of dollars in volatile corporate stock, massively complex federal evidence chains, and the physical safety of our highly vulnerable key whistleblowers hung entirely in the balance of these final ticking hours. He strictly forbade me from offering any advanced warning, no matter how subtle, to my parents or my sister. He painted a terrifyingly clear picture of the consequences. If Sloan or my father made one single panicked phone call to a Belmere board member or a corporate defense lawyer, the opposing legal teams could instantly file emergency injunctions, severely compromising 36 months of agonizing, dangerous work. I offered a single, resolute nod, accepting the heavy, isolating burden of my mandated silence. I severed the encrypted connection, and the screen plunged into total darkness. I stood alone in the freezing coastal wind for a long moment, filling my lungs with the sharp air, bracing my nervous system to re-enter the theater of the absurd. As I pulled open the heavy glass door and stepped back into the blindingly bright, echoing ballroom, my path was instantly and aggressively blocked. Sloane materialized directly in front of me, clutching a fresh, brimming glass of expensive rose champagne. Her cheeks were deeply flushed with alcohol and the intoxicating, dizzying high of unchallenged vanity. She looked me up and down, her dark eyes glittering with a malicious, utterly confident amusement. She loudly noted my brief absence, expertly projecting her voice to ensure the cluster of wealthy cousins standing nearby could hear every single word of her impending mockery. She tilted her head, adopting a tone of exaggerated, venomous pity that grated against my eardrums. She loudly speculated that I must have been hiding outside in the freezing dark to desperately beg a former corporate colleague for a miserable, entry-level data processing job. Or perhaps, she mused with a cruel chuckle, I was quietly pleading with a disgruntled loan officer to extend my rapidly depleting credit limit. She stepped significantly closer, the overwhelming scent of her expensive designer perfume clashing violently with the crisp scent of the ocean clinging to my clothes. She offered a piece of unsolicited, highly arrogant advice, stating clearly that truly successful, powerful people never have to scurry into the shadows to take their phone calls. Real power, she declared with absolute, unwavering certainty, always operates directly in the brightest light. The sheer, absolute irony of her arrogant statement was almost blinding in its intensity. She was arrogantly lecturing me about operating in the light while her entire precious corporate empire, her massive upcoming promotion, and her very identity were built entirely in the darkest, most predatory shadows of immense human suffering. I did not shrink back from her aggressive, territorial posture. I did not lower my gaze to the patterned carpet as she so clearly expected me to do. I squared my shoulders and looked directly into the absolute center of her eyes. The ambient temperature between us seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single second. My voice was incredibly soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a lethal, freezing weight that caused the smug, victorious smile on her face to falter for just a fraction of a second. I looked at the golden child of the Thomas family and told her that by tomorrow morning, she would desperately, agonizingly wish she had taken the time to ask me just one genuine, kind question. For a terrifying, suspended second, I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty cross her perfectly contoured, arrogant features. She recognized instantly that my tone did not belong to a defeated, humiliated younger sister begging for scraps of respect. It was the heavy final tone of an executioner calmly reading a finalized death sentence. But her ego was simply too massive, her belief in her own invincibility too deeply entrenched, to allow any actual room for self-reflection or caution. The brief flash of uncertainty vanished entirely, instantly replaced by a loud, theatrical burst of dismissive laughter. She threw her head back, her laughter ringing out sharply across the immediate vicinity, deliberately drawing the approving attention of our parents standing near the dessert table. She loudly dismissed my chilling warning as the pathetic, dramatic last gasp of a woman whose entire life was rapidly collapsing into total irrelevance. She turned sharply on her heel and glided smoothly back toward the bright center of the party, eager to continue basking in the warm, blinding glow of her own manufactured greatness. I remained standing perfectly still near the balcony doors, watching her walk away into the crowd. The live string quartet began playing a lively, aggressively upbeat classical piece, entirely drowning out the sound of the crashing waves outside. The wealthy relatives continued to toast their own brilliance, clinking their crystal glasses, completely oblivious to the massive, terrifying shadow rapidly expanding over their heads. The digital clock on my phone was silently, relentlessly ticking away the final few minutes. The heavy reinforced doors of the real world were violently knocking, and absolutely no one in that opulent room possessed the power to keep them shut any longer. The massive mahogany doors of the banquet hall swung shut, sealing us inside a meticulously curated bubble of false opulence. The formal dinner service commenced with an aggressive display of wealth. Waiters in pressed uniforms marched in synchronized columns, delivering plates of seared scallops and pouring streams of vintage red wine into fragile crystal goblets. The heavy scent of roasted meats and melting beeswax candles hung thick in the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere of forced intimacy. At the absolute front of the room, positioned directly beneath a cascading floral chandelier, stood the main head table. Behind it, the massive digital projector screen remained illuminated, casting a pale, clinical glow over the pristine white linen and polished silver. I sat in my designated chair near the back exit, my posture perfectly rigid, my hands resting lightly in my lap. The ambient roar of 100 intersecting conversations slowly died down as the sharp, demanding ring of a silver spoon tapping against a wine glass echoed through the hall. Sloane stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her silk dress, her diamond jewelry catching the candlelight, and moved gracefully toward the standing microphone positioned at the center of the stage. She was practically glowing with the intoxicating thrill of absolute dominance. This was her keynote address. This was the moment she had engineered to officially crown herself the reigning monarch of our generation. She began her speech by grandly welcoming our distinguished guests, her voice dripping with practiced corporate warmth. She spoke at length about the enduring legacy of our bloodline. She used heavy, imposing words. She declared that our family has always valued those who build, those who contribute, and those who represent the absolute standard of excellence. She paced the stage slowly, making deliberate eye contact with the wealthiest uncles and the most successful cousins. Every single sentence was a carefully constructed brick in a towering wall, designed entirely to separate the worthy from the worthless. She painted a picture of a family that conquered markets, dominated boardrooms, and shaped the physical skyline of coastal cities. As she spoke about aggressive expansion and relentless ambition, her gaze inevitably, predictably, drifted toward the back of the room. She looked directly at me. The underlying message was not subtle. It was a public, televised eviction from the family circle. She was explicitly defining the parameters of our shared bloodline, and she was making it abundantly clear that I no longer met the minimum requirements for entry. After 10 grueling minutes of self-congratulation and flattering the seated executives, Sloane dramatically altered her tone. The triumphant, booming cadence of her voice softened into a sickeningly sweet, patronizing purr. She leaned slightly over the podium, gripping the edges with both hands, and adopted the compassionate expression of a billionaire throwing pennies to a beggar. She told the silent room that true leadership was not just about securing massive contracts or expanding territories. She claimed that true leadership also required immense charity, specifically toward those who had lost their way. She looked directly at me again, her eyes wide with a perfectly rehearsed, entirely fabricated concern. She announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, that Belmere Development was currently expanding its regional outreach divisions. She generously offered to personally bypass the standard hiring protocols and secure a junior assistant position for me within their local communications department. She explicitly detailed the humiliating parameters of the role right there in front of 100 guests. She said I could start by drafting minor press releases for local zoning board meetings and managing the community complaint inbox. She pitched it as a tremendous, merciful opportunity for me to finally re-enter the professional world, learn basic corporate discipline, and perhaps, eventually, earn my way back into a respectable life. The sheer audacity of the offer was breathtaking. She was attempting to recruit me into the very criminal enterprise I was currently destroying, and she was framing it as an act of profound sisterly love. Before I could even blink, Grant loudly scraped his chair back and stood up at his table. He raised his glass of expensive red wine high into the air, completely eager to act as Sloane's primary supporting vocalist. He projected his deep broadcasting voice across the room, declaring that every single person deserves a second chance, no matter how badly they have failed in the past. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and deep disgust. He loudly advised me to accept the generous lifeline my sister was throwing. He stated that it was time to stop living in the shadows, to stop relying on vague mysteries to sound interesting, and to finally learn how to create actual, tangible value in the real world. I slowly turned my head to look at our mother. She was seated directly to the right of the podium. This was the moment any decent parent would intervene. This was the moment a mother should stand up, raise her hand, and demand an end to the public humiliation of her own child. But she did nothing. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed firmly on her untouched plate of food. She took a slow sip of her water, deliberately refusing to meet my gaze. Her suffocating silence was the loudest sound in the entire room. She was entirely complicit. She had fully accepted my role as the designated sacrificial lamb, perfectly willing to let her youngest daughter be transformed into a brutal educational example to elevate her eldest. Right at that exact second, the massive projector screen behind Sloan abruptly changed. The rotating loop of generic family crests and resort logos vanished. It was replaced by a highly stylized, stark white summary slide detailing the professional status of our generation. It featured our names aligned in neat rows. Next to Marcus, the words Chief of Surgery gleamed in dark blue. Next to Grant, the words Financial Broadcaster stood out proudly. Next to Sloan, her massive vice presidential title dominated the space. And then, at the very bottom of the list, isolated and completely devoid of any accompanying achievements, was my name. Directly beneath it, projected in massive, bold, blood-red letters that were significantly larger and clearer than any other text on the screen, was a single word: unemployed. It was the final, devastating gunshot of their coordinated execution. The slide was designed to be the ultimate punchline to Sloan's deeply insulting job offer. The entire grand ballroom plunged into a dead, terrifying silence. 100 pairs of eyes slowly turned away from the blindingly bright screen and locked onto my face, sitting in the dim shadows of the back row. They stopped eating. They stopped breathing. They were collectively, eagerly waiting for the inevitable snap. They fully expected me to finally break under the crushing, unbearable weight of the evening. They wanted a dramatic, satisfying reaction. They were waiting for me to burst into humiliated tears, to scream in bitter anger, or to push my chair back and run out of the room in total, absolute defeat. They truly believed that tonight they had finally found the precise amount of pressure required to crush me into dust. I sat perfectly motionless. I did not drop my gaze. I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. I simply stared back at the sea of expectant, cruel faces, absorbing their collective hostility without absorbing a single ounce of their intended shame. Then, a sharp, distinct vibration pulsed against my thigh. My phone, resting silently in the deep pocket of my dress, had just received a priority alert. I slowly, deliberately, reached down and pulled the device out. I did not try to hide my actions. I held the phone up above the edge of the table, the screen illuminating my face with a pale, cold digital light. I tapped the screen once. There was a single, encrypted message from the lead attorney. It contained exactly 4 words: "It is live, everywhere." The fuse had burned completely down. The bomb had officially detonated. I slowly lowered the phone and placed it face up on the crisp white linen tablecloth. I looked up. My eyes swept across the room, passing over my silent mother, lingering briefly on Grant's smug face, and finally locking onto Sloan, who was still standing proudly at the podium beneath the massive, insulting projection of my supposed failure. I felt a wave of absolute, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. It was the freezing, crystal-clear calm of an apex predator that has just successfully locked its jaws around the neck of its prey. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice to compete with their manufactured grandeur. I spoke very quietly, but my voice carried a strange, heavy acoustic weight that sliced cleanly through the dead silence of the room, echoing off the high ceilings and chilling the air. Everyone should check their phones. The silence in the grand ballroom was not broken by a scream or a shout, but by a sudden, synchronized mechanical symphony. It started at the front tables, a sharp chime from a smartphone, then two more. Then a cascade of chimes, buzzes, and customized ringtones erupting from every single tailored pocket and beaded evening bag in the room. Smartwatches strapped to wealthy wrists vibrated simultaneously, illuminating the dim space with hundreds of tiny, harsh digital lights. The attendees, previously locked onto my face, instinctively looked down at their devices. I watched as the collective expression of my family shifted in less than 3 seconds, from arrogant amusement to absolute, paralyzing confusion. On every single glowing screen, pushed through breaking news alerts from every major global media outlet, was the exact same image. It was the newly released digital cover of Time magazine. Staring back at them from their own devices was a high-resolution portrait of my face, looking resolute and entirely unyielding. The bold text of the headline was impossible to misinterpret. It did not mention freelance consulting or a desperate need to rebuild a failed career. The subtitle declared me the sole architect of Atlas Ledger. It detailed how my invisible empire had successfully armed millions of American citizens to reclaim stolen disaster relief funds, hijacked property deeds, and manipulated insurance payouts following devastating wildfires and catastrophic floods. The article did not merely paint me as a national whistleblower, it explicitly laid out the agonizing, meticulous investigation that exposed the massive corporate predators executing forced property buyouts. And then, the true payload was delivered directly into their hands. The leading paragraph of the exposé officially named the primary syndicate at the center of the massive federal investigation, Belmere Development. The very same corporation whose golden sponsor logo was proudly printed on the back of the heavy family yearbooks resting on their laps. I remained completely seated in the shadows, watching the shockwave tear through the room. Sloane physically collapsed back into her chair, as if she had been violently pushed. All the manufactured color drained instantly from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking ashen and terrifyingly hollow. The massive coastal acquisition deal she had just spent an hour boasting about, the prestigious national executive title she was eagerly anticipating, and the lavish corporate funding of our family reunion had instantly transmuted into highly publicized evidence of her own profound blindness and potential criminal complicity. She was staring at the glowing screen of her tablet, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the reality of her shattered universe finally set in. My father stood frozen near the dessert station. The heavy crystal glass of cognac slipped entirely from his grip, shattering loudly against the polished marble floor. He stared blankly at his phone, the horrific realization washing over his aging features. He finally understood that those prestigious letters of recommendation he had so eagerly signed, the ones he thought proved his immense political influence, had been ruthlessly weaponized to grant social legitimacy to a predatory system. He had unknowingly handed the keys of his pristine reputation to the architects of a massive fraud. He had spent decades carefully cultivating a pristine image of conservative wealth and undeniable respectability. Now, he was facing the absolute certainty that his name would be dragged through federal court filings and splashed across national news networks as an unwitting accomplice to disaster profiteering. The sheer humiliation of being used so easily, of being outsmarted by the very corporate sharks he admired, visibly aged him 10 years in a matter of seconds. To my right, my mother began to weep. It was not her usual theatrical crying designed to garner polite sympathy or manipulate a social situation. This was the raw, breathless sobbing of a woman struck by pure terror. She looked up from her screen and stared directly at me. In her tear-filled eyes, I saw the crushing weight of her epiphany. She realized, in a single, devastating moment, that she had spent the last 3 years actively labeling the strongest, most capable person in our entire bloodline as a pathetic failure, simply because my success could not be easily categorized by her superficial country club vocabulary. She had publicly agreed to label me unemployed, and now the entire world was reading about how I had single-handedly dismantled a billion-dollar corruption ring. Grant desperately tried to maintain the crumbling illusion. He slammed his hands down on the white linen tablecloth. his voice stammering and pitching high with panic. He loudly insisted to the paralyzed guests around him that this was clearly a massive media misunderstanding, a coordinated smear campaign executed by disgruntled former employees. He tried to use his broadcaster voice, but it cracked under the immense pressure of the truth. The glowing screens in their hands offered absolutely no escape. The comprehensive article included highly detailed financial flowcharts, heavily redacted but undeniable offshore wire transfers, heart-wrenching sworn testimonies from the displaced victims, and the undeniable stamp of Atlas Ledger. Every single verbal exit Grant tried to build was immediately boarded up by the staggering weight of hard, irrefutable data. The absolute pinnacle of the evening arrived when Sloane suddenly pushed herself up from her chair. The arrogant, untouchable golden child stumbled frantically around the edge of the head table. She practically ran toward the back of the room, her silk dress catching on the edges of the chairs. She stopped inches away from me, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. The woman who, less than 5 minutes ago, had condescendingly offered me a humiliating junior assistant role was now trembling violently. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. All the practiced poise, the media training, the polished corporate armor had completely evaporated. She was babbling incoherently about her stock options, her real estate holdings, and the fact that she had personally signed off on the Gulf Coast acquisitions just 3 days ago. She desperately begged me to help her understand what was happening. She pleaded with me, her voice cracking, asking if she was going to face federal prison time, begging the sister she had just publicly executed to explain the terrifying reality of the actual world to her. It was the absolute, most expensive form of revenge. I did not have to lift a single finger. Her own corporate masters had built the trap, and she had eagerly locked herself inside. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not offer a cruel, mocking laugh or a bitter, triumphant speech. I simply looked at her shaking hands and then up at the hundreds of terrified faces staring at me across the silent ballroom. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that carried to the furthest corners of the room. I told them I did not orchestrate this specific night to humiliate anyone. I explained that the family had eagerly and voluntarily written my pathetic role for me, while the absolute truth simply arrived exactly on its scheduled timeline. While the entire room remained frozen in terror, illuminated only by the glow of the breaking news alerts in their hands, I quietly pushed my chair back and stood up. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. I did not stay to bask in the glow of their destruction. My true victory was never about securing my face on a magazine cover or watching my family crumble in a banquet hall. My victory was knowing that the forgotten, desperate people outside those walls finally had someone powerful enough to drag them out from under the crushing wheels of that corrupt machine. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me with a solid, resounding thud, completely cutting off the sounds of their panic. I walked through the opulent lobby of the resort, past the confused concierge desk, and out into the expansive circular driveway. The valet brought my entirely unremarkable 10-year-old sedan around. I tipped him with a $20 bill, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I drove away from the blazing lights of the coastal resort, the heavy burden I had carried for 36 months finally lifted from my shoulders. I left my family behind to confront the empty space I had occupied with eyes that could no longer afford the luxury of arrogance. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening to this story from so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.